Good afternoon. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the second session of the UBS Economic Forum. My name is Hans-Joachim Voth. I'm a professor here at the University of Zurich. And I will first introduce the speakers and then introduce the theme before we hand over to the speakers for their introductory statements. So on the very left of the podium is Professor Joel Mokyr. He's arguably the most influential economic historian alive. He's worked on an amazing range of topics, from the Great Irish Famine to the history of technology and the sources of the arrival of modern economic growth as a result of Enlightenment influence. In the middle is Professor Guido Tabellini from the Bocconi University. He's the former rector of Bocconi. He's a leading authority on political economy and the effect of constitutions, and recently has started to work in cultural economics and the influence of culture on democratic developments. And on the very far right is Guy Verhofstadt, the former Prime Minister of Belgium, a current member of the European Parliament, and what the Americans would call an enthusiastic federalist, meaning believing in the cause of a unified Europe. So our theme today is political union and cultural diversity. And we're going to have a wide range of different aspects and angles to this topic. If you forgive me a moment of personal commentary, I'm German by birth, educated in the United Kingdom. I spent 15 years in Spain. In the meantime, acquired a Catalan wife. So I know a lot about cultural differences. And what a rule means, it's very different between Northern and Southern Europe. I experience that on a regular basis. There's a wonderful Spanish phrase if you're trying to go out. Some of you may have experienced this, for example, that one of the two in a couple is not ready. And if you keep asking when are we going to go, the Spanish phrase ahora vengo does not mean I'm coming now. That is the literal translation. It means thank you for not asking again. So there are many possibilities for misunderstandings. And some of the questions we could explore this afternoon is, for example, how much is cultural differences a problem in terms of economic policy making? Did we actually understand what rules mean symmetrically around the table when the Maastricht Treaty was signed, or did only the Germans think that the rules would ever be implemented? Does Europe actually need more cultural convergence, or is the glory of Europe its diversity? Is it the origin of its success and one of the things we should do everything we can to preserve? And with these questions, which I'm sure we will not answer definitively, I hand over to Joel Mokyr. You have 15 minutes.
Axel Weber started off by saying, let's not dwell on the past. And ladies and gentlemen, I am going to dwell about nothing but the past, not because it holds any good lessons for the future. I'm not sure it does, but for the same reason we climb Mount Everest, because it's there. So this is a shameless advertisement for my new book. What I'm going to say, much of it is based on a forthcoming book that I'll urge you to buy immediately 5 copies of as soon as it comes out, and give it to all your friends. And then I'm going to start with a quotation. And this is a quotation from Edward Gibbon. And I think it's extremely insightful. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, since you can all read, but essentially it's a statement about European diversity. Europe is now divided into 12 powerful, unequal kingdoms, blah, 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 blah. And then the point is that fragmentation, that political fragmentation, the abuses of tyranny are restrained by mutual influence. And you can sort of see where Gibbon is coming from, because he was writing, of course, about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and clearly because it was unified, it was weak, and because Europe is fragmented, it is strong. But this is a view widely shared at the time. Here's another, Enlightenment superstar, David Hume, and he makes what I still think is an incredibly insightful comment about the difference between Europe and China, which is all the more surprising because he knew very little about China. He'd never been there and just got his stuff from second and third hand sources. But he makes, I think, a very acute observation when he says in China there was a great deal of science which might have been expected to ripen into something more perfect, but it didn't happen. Why? Because there was one vast empire speaking one language, not quite true, but governed by one law, and ta-ta-ta-ta-tam. And so none had the courage, to the last bottom line, to resist the torrent of popular opinion, and posterity was not bold enough to dispute which had been universally received by their ancestors. That's, I think, a very, very deep insight. Now, modern scholars have agreed with that, and I'm going to give you a list of them, not going to any of that work, but people from both economic history, political scientists, economists, have all agreed that fragmentation, in some sense, was quite a good thing for Europe. Also, these people emphasize more, I think, the institutional and fiscal aspects of it than the cultural aspects. And so the argument of my forthcoming book, or one of the arguments, is exactly that between 1500 and 1700, intellectual development in Europe benefited a great deal from this political fragmentation, and that development ultimately carried to huge economic payoffs that led to the Industrial Revolution and to the emergence of modern economic growth. Now, the competition we're looking at is not just between political units, it's also within political units, between different regions and different authorities. Of course, it's also between religions once the Reformation occurs. And of course, there's a cost and a benefit to this. I'm not going to talk about the cost, but the cost we all know is the result of hugely destructive religious and other wars that occurred between 1500 and 1700. So this is not obviously a net advantage for Europe, but from the point of view of where we are sitting, which is we are the beneficiaries of this economic growth, this is clearly a very important thing. Now, I want to say something about scale and intellectual innovation. There are, of course, very obvious and important economies of scale in intellectual innovation, since each new idea basically is produced at some cost by its innovator, and then there's basically low or zero cost spreading it to everybody else. So the larger your constituency, the better it is for you, because you spread your cost over a larger audience. But the problem is that, of course, single political units, such as the Roman Empire or Ming-Qing China or the Ottoman Empire for that matter, they lose the dynamic strength of competition and keeping a nation on its toes. And so my argument is that Europe was, in this period, was able to benefit, to enjoy the benefits of large scale and of fragmentation at the same time. So in that sense, they're having the best of all possible worlds. And the key to understanding that is a transnational pan-European institution, which was known at the time as the Respublica Literaria, or the Republic of Letters. And what it is, it's a very weird kind of creation. It's a transnational community, and we would call it today a virtual community. Of course, they didn't call it themselves like that. And it's connected largely by epistolary networks, as I say, correspondence, and by publications. Its members were all part of the intellectual crème de la crème of European societies. Writers, physicians, theologians, mathematicians, physicists, and so on, as well as people we would not consider intellectuals today, but they surely did, astrologers, alchemists, magicians, and people of that nature. It emerges in the early Renaissance. No exact date can be, of course, placed on it, but by 1550 it is in full flourishing, and it really continues in Europe until the French Revolution and beyond. And because it is pan-European, intellectuals can get the advantage of publishing in one place and having readership all over the continent. So books that were published in Edinburgh within a year could be read in Krakow and in Naples and in Madrid. And that, of course, is the nature of a pan-European community. And the people within it, roughly speaking, I think, ignore differences in ethnic origin and in religion. Not always, but as much as was feasible at the time. And at the same time, of course, political fragmentation, on which this thing is superimposed, as it were, is crucial to its success. And that's the point I want to get across clearly and transparently. To see this, we have to understand that intellectual activity, like all economic activity, depends on the proper set of incentives. And here I'd like to distinguish between two kinds of incentives, positive and negative incentives, and they're both important for my story. Positive incentives is essentially the sort of classic problem of any kind of intellectual production, which is it's almost impossible to get paid for it, right? I mean, you can't sell an idea and then hope ever to establish property rights on it, because if you tell it to somebody, that he may tell it to a third person, and you've lost control. This is an old problem of appropriability of intellectual assets, and it's, economists have been worrying about this for a long time, and I'll tell you what the solution was at this time. There's also a matter of negative incentives, which is perhaps a little bit less clear, but once you think about it, it's obvious. And that is that incumbents always have an incentive to try to resist innovation which threatens to devalue their human capital. And they come up with concepts like heresy and apostasy and sacrilege and so on in order to protect their intellectual capital rather than to defend something that is really sacrosanct. So the way the positive incentives worked at this time, and this is not by design, this is an emergent property that came about without anybody planning it that way, is that intellectual innovation becomes something of a reputation game at this time, in the sense that it is still very much the case among academics today. We write articles and books not because we expect to be paid for them, but because it enhances our reputation. And of course, our reputation is largely dependent on what our peers think of it. So this is some slightly different version of what we would call today peer review. This is, ladies and gentlemen, a highly competitive process. And what happens is that reputation is strongly correlated with patronage. And patronage is essentially a set of services that is provided to an intellectual by giving him or her a position either at a university, which is what most patronage consists of today, or at a court of some princely court where the prince would like to have some intellectual around. And so why would they like to have these intellectuals around? Well, in part, there's clearly a demonstration effect there as well. You know, you want to have the smartest mathematician, the best astrologer, just as you would like to have the best painter and the best composer in your court. But it's also true that intellectuals did provide quite tangible services at the time, such as medical services, tutoring children. For instance, Queen Christina of Sweden hired René Descartes himself to come to Stockholm to tutor her children, as military advisors, as engineers, and on and on and on and on. So there is clearly a demand for these people, but the way they are being selected is through reputation. The way you acquire your reputation is by publishing or getting your name known to people in the field, very much like it is today. Now, because this institution is transnational, it of course means that these intellectuals are moving around in Europe, and thus they could receive very attractive positions, and there was sharp competition among them, not just at the local, but at the European level. Fine, I'm getting there. And you know, there are certain superstars, such as, you know, we all know them, Galileo, Newton, Leibniz, Huygens, who did extremely well and set a model for others, defining, in that sense, a strong incentive structure. Now, not all of these intellectuals needed patronage, but I would say the majority of them clearly did. At the same time, there's the issue of the negative incentives. So as far as negative incentives are concerned, fragmentation means basically that there are plenty of reactionary powers in Europe, but because they are fragmented, they suffer from a colossal coordination failure in which there's always some place you can go to. And even if the place where you are right now is kind of inhospitable to you. And in that regard, what is really striking is, despite some famous heresy trials, Galileo's is the most famous one, but there are a few others, this is in fact far rarer than we suppose, and certainly after 1650 there is very little left of it. And the reason is quite obvious, because the rulers knew, and the intellectuals knew that the rulers knew, that they were footloose. And that if you basically try to suppress innovation, these people would just pack up and go. And of course, many of them did. You know, the famous Swiss doctor Paracelsus moved 27 times in his lifetime because he made himself insufferable anywhere he went. But many of these other intellectuals moved away from their home countries when things became unpleasant, including, of course, Locke, who wrote the Essay on Tolerance in the Netherlands, and Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan in Paris, and Hugo de Groot, the great Dutch jurist, who was famous, as every Dutch schoolboy knows, was smuggled out in a bookcase from Castle Loevestein and ended up in Paris. So these people move around, and because everybody knows that they can move around, there's very little opportunity to suppress them. But what's more, they're very good at playing one power against another. So here's one of my favorite examples. This is Tommaso Campanella, who was a Dominican friar, not a very good one, I suppose. He was accused of heresy by the Spanish Inquisition and sentenced to jail also for anti-Spanish activities. Now, you'd think he's a bad example because he spends 27 years in a Neapolitan jail. But while in jail, he was under the protection of the Emperor Rudolf, the cousin of the Spanish king. And basically, thanks to him, he was treated very well, to the point where he wrote 5 books in jail, including his famous City of the Sun, as well as a pamphlet defending Galileo. So he can't have been suppressed very, very seriously. After 1650, basically the negative incentives disappear. And we get people who a century earlier would have been burned at the stake as heretics, and by this time they get away with it. Most famous, of course, is Spinoza, but there's some other people who are known to be what was known at that time as free thinkers, John Toland, Julien Lamétrie. These were people who were just outrageous in terms of the time, and yet these sanctions against them were sort of very mild. At some point, Lamétrie is told, we really would not like you to be around here. Why don't you go somewhere else? So he goes to Sanssouci in Prussia, and Frederick the Great keeps him around as some kind of a clown. So people could be persecuted, but it became increasingly ineffective because of fragmentation. And the same is, of course, true for the printing press. So after his trial, Galileo's books are banned in Italy, so they're just published north of the Alps in places like Strasbourg and Leiden, and the books just have as much circulation as they would ever have. So to sum up then, between 1500 and 1750, Europe enjoys the best of all possible worlds. It enjoyed the advantages of fragmentation, pluralism, competition, and the failure of coordination among those powers who would like to stop progress. Yet it still has an integrated market for ideas that's pan-European, in which the competition for ideas is Europe-wide, and people can write books in Poland and in Scotland and in Spain, and essentially try to persuade each other many, many hundreds of miles away. That, I think, is the foundation of a set of intellectual changes that eventually, of course, lead to scientific and technological changes that are the taproot of all economic growth. The net result, then, that those two related phenomena between them made the modern economy. And there's 2 that I'd like to mention. The first is the emergence of open science, in which every scientist and every intellectual essentially places his or her findings in the public domain, making them accessible to everybody in order to gain a reputation. That's been well known since a seminal paper by David and Dasgupta, as well as, and here I'm sort of touting my own work, out of this institution emerged something which we today call the Enlightenment. And although no 2 historians will ever agree on exactly what the Enlightenment was, I would say that without it, economic growth as we know it today would not have happened. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much to Ernst and Fabrizio for having invited me to this very interesting event. I guess the whole European project so far has been working with the idea that was started out by Monet of a functionalist approach, that we start to centralizing policy area in some domain, This generates some contradiction and some pressure for more integration, and so we go to the next step of additional integration in some other domain. And this principle is very well, of course, applied very much to the single currency, and is well summarized by this quote by one of the founding fathers of the single currency, Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa, that was in turn quoted in a very nice recent paper by Guido, Sapienza, and Zingales. And Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa said, "The road towards the single currency looks like a chain reaction in which each step resolved a pre-existing contradiction and generated a new one that in turn required a further step forward." And of course, we have taken many steps, and there are not many steps left to take. Probably the next big step is really political integration if we want to achieve further centralization of the European level in a meaningful way. And indeed, political integration was foreseen as the arrival point of the single currency. I think this doctrine was not implicit, was explicit when the single currency was launched in Europe. But political union doesn't mean just to centralize functions in Brussels and then hold elections to give legitimate democratic accountability. It really also means that to be successful, we need to have cross-border coalitions. We need the left in Italy to vote with the left in Germany, and likewise for the right. And so the question is, are we really ready for forming cross-border coalitions in the foreseeable future? Not now, but in the foreseeable future in Europe. And I think, unfortunately, I want to give a negative answer to this question in the foreseeable future. I think for two reasons. One reason that may be familiar to Switzerland is that language is a barrier that implies that there is no really a common European public space in which you hold a policy debate on European issues. Now, we have a lot of debates on European issues, but they are all at the national level. They are not at the European level, maybe because of language, maybe because the media segment the policy debates. This picture represents the percentage of articles in which one of these individuals is quoted in some of the major newspapers in a number of European countries. The individuals are the president of the US, the head of the national government, and the president of the European Commission. And what is striking is not so much how little the president of the European Commission is quoted, but the fact that there is no trend throughout this period. It's really flat, except when in the vertical lines, when the new commission is elected. That's when you get a little bit of press attention. Now, one may argue that this is an artifact, that the European Commission president is not very powerful, so perhaps looking at other policymakers, we get a different picture. And indeed, here you see the percentages of times in which in the national press the national governors are quoted and the percentage of articles in which the ECB president is quoted. And here you see instead a big trend with starting particularly during the recent financial crisis. But however, this doesn't help because as you see, you get more attention, but you don't get more trust. So the trust in the ECB actually takes a plunge precisely when you get more attention towards the ECB. And this takes me to the second reason why I'm skeptical that you are going to have genuine cross-border coalitions in Europe, and that is divergent national interests. Here you see the GDP per capita in the major European countries since the sovereign debt crisis erupted. I think the forecasts by the IMF are unfortunately maybe a little optimistic, but you see even despite this optimism, this huge divergence. And this huge divergence, of course, means, as we heard in the previous discussion today, that there are genuine conflict of interest between these different countries. And these conflict of interests are not going to go away. They are not cyclical phenomena. They are really deep conflict of interest that will remain. And I think these two features, having separate debates on European policy issues and having genuinely conflicting economic interests, means that in different parts of Europe you have developed very different narratives about the sources of the problems that we have. In Southern Europe, the typical narrative is that the ongoing crisis is due to serious and very bad mismanagement of the crisis by European policymakers, and exit from these problems requires a U-turn in the euro area monetary and fiscal policy. In Northern Europe, the narrative is that the crisis reflects serious policy mistakes at the national level in Southern Europe, that these countries have no alternative but reform, and in fact that the pain is helpful because of a moral hazard argument, that without the pain these reforms would not be forthcoming. And probably there are elements of truth in both of these narratives, but the point is that they are very starkly different. And so the result is that precisely when we needed more confidence in the European government, we have seen exactly the opposite. The divergence in national economic interests shows that virtually everywhere, it's surprising that in Greece and Portugal this didn't happen, when asked about whether the EU should develop further into a federation of nation states, you see a dramatic plunge in the positive answers to this question. This is not just a feature of the Eurobarometer, it applies also to other surveys that were asked. This is the Pew Research Center that asked, what do you think about, do you favor or oppose giving more decision-making power to the European Union? And as you see recently, you see an increase in the opposition. Remember that there are many don't know answers, and so the percentage of people that actually are in favor is always strictly less than 50%. And of course, the surge in anti-European sentiments in the domestic national politics is a further confirmation of these facts. So I think the reality, unfortunately, is that the chain reaction method with a single currency backfired. We did some elements of further step forwards in the banking union, maybe with a fiscal compact, but also we created very genuinely conflicting interests, and this has brought about more distrust and more divisiveness. And I think this stands in very sharp contrast to the way in which political integration was achieved in the historical episodes where it was successful, where instead integration was the result of existential threats because of foreign policy threats, essentially. And this, of course, created shared interests, not divided interests, and hence political integration. But unfortunately or fortunately, barring surprises from Mr. Putin, we are unlikely to see such existential threats coming forward in the European Union. So I think I'm left with a pessimistic outlook that we are stuck. The single currency did presuppose that eventually would lead to further political integration. And in particular, it did presuppose that the debate which is now conducted from a national perspective, what is in the interest of Southern Europe, what is in the interest of Germany, instead should be conducted from the perspective of what is in the interest of the euro area currency. And this further political integration with some elements of a common fiscal policy and a common budget on which to manage the crisis situation is not going to forthcome. And at the same time, going backwards is probably too costly from an economic and a political point of view. So if this grim outlook is correct on political integration, probably we are looking forward to a long periods of stagnation, particularly in Southern Europe, and I hope to be wrong. Thank you.
Verhofstadt is next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me. I do it in the old-fashioned way. I have no slides, but I'm a politician, so that's maybe the difference with a professor. He used slides, professor, and a politician has to do it in a rhetorical way. First of all, if you allow me, thanking you for the invitation, I want a little bit to react in the introduction that has been made, where immediately it seems that we have now two identities in Europe. You have the identity of the Northern Europeans and the identity of the Southern Europeans. The Northern Europeans should be disciplined, always don't have fiscal deficits, and in the South, it doesn't matter anyhow. I have to tell you that it doesn't is quite an accurate image of the reality, because the first country who breached, in fact, the Stability Pact was Germany in 2004. Maybe many people have already forgotten. And when I see the speed and the discipline with whom the Germans, for the moment, are opening their new airport in Berlin, I'm not so sure that discipline is their main virtue also for the moment. There they look more like South Europeans, I should say. It's true that there is an enormous cultural diversity in Europe. If we look to the languages, for example, we have 24 official languages in the European Union, but in fact that's only a part of the languages, because in total there are 80 languages that are spoken on the European continent. And if you tell that, and if you say that, then Eurosceptics immediately react and say, yeah, and that is under threat, that cultural diversity, this national identities, the cultural identities, under threat of the European Union. Where it is clear that the European Union has never said and has never had as a goal to create a one-size-fits-all culture in the European Union. On the contrary. So, in my opinion, if you allow me, the destruction or the threat on cultural diversity in Europe started not by the creation of the European Union. In the 50s with the coal and steel community. The threat on the cultural diversity in Europe and the rise of this fear of loss of identities started, in fact, in the 19th century, by the ending of the 18th and in the 19th century, by the rise of the nation states and the start of nationalism on the European continent. Because in the 19th century, the birth of the nation state was the idea that it was useful to produce societies that were uniform in terms of language and in terms of culture. And this resulted naturally in the creation, the establishment of a huge number of nation states on the European continent, where in the previous times, there was a far more mixture of identities and culture in Europe. To illustrate that, I'm always referring to a book of somebody who lived for a time in Zurich, Elias Canetti, the Nobel Prize winner, in his autobiography, in the first tome, where he is starting and describing where he was born. He said, I'm born in Ručuk, that is now Rus, on the border between Romania and Bulgaria, on the Donau. And we spoke in of city 7 languages. And then he starts to enumerate what his languages were. There was naturally Bulgarian, there was Romanian, because that was on the other side of the river. There was Russian, because many people worked from Russia in that time in Rus, in Ručuk. They spoke also Turkish, because it was the Ottoman Empire. That's the reason why it was named Ručuk at that time. he himself and a number of his citizens of his village spoke naturally also Spanish, and where Spanish is spoken, Catalan is spoken too, as we know. Also in Ruchuk, because there was a big community of Sephardian Jews living in that city. And then he is continuing and telling when in the week when we went to Vienna, then we spoke German. And that were the 7 languages that were currently used in Ruchuk, in Rus. And that is the description given by Elias Canetti. If you go now to Ruchuk, you shall see a very European city, like all cities in Europe, very similar, but they speak only, in fact, Bulgarian. All the other languages had disappeared. And that's my point that I want to make. The cultural Europe, the mixture of culture and invention that we got in the 17th, in the 18th century has been destroyed, in fact, in Europe in the 19th centuries by nationalism, by creating what I call monolingual and mono-ethnic islands in Europe. And that ended, as we all know, with the Shoah in the Second World War and in the return of the Germans behind their borders. And that has been the end. Until since then, Europe, the mixture of culture and identities has disappeared. Europe today, the European Union as such, is a number of monolingual and mono-ethnic islands. If you look, for example, to a country like Poland, Poland was a very multicultural country. Today, it's not longer the case. There are, in the past, there were many societies who lived there. That's no longer the case. And so my point is that when we are talking about cultural diversity, we first of all have to have a good definition of what it means. If it means a mixture of what I call identities, cultures, and so as we have seen in the past, that has disappeared for quite a long time in Europe. My second point that I want to make in this introduction is the fact that when we talk about cultural diversity in Europe, what is indeed important, and we have to cherish it, but we should also be aware of the fact that from a geopolitical perspective, these differences are maybe not so big. And that has been said. There is a common European civilization, a common European culture that is certainly important and that has its roots in the Enlightenment, in the Aufklärung, in the 18th century. And one of the most successful export products is not a consumer good, but is, in my opinion, a typical cultural and political value, the separation of powers as the basis for a sound political system. It's maybe the export product by essence of the European Union. And when I'm saying, maybe this cultural diversity, when you look at it in a more geopolitical sense, then what I see is that there is a European culture and there is also a European model. The Swedish and the Italian way, for example, of organizing their welfare state are practically the same. We discuss about it, but they are practically the same. They have the same principles in Sweden and in Italy, or at least they are much similar, for example, than the Swedish way to organize a social security, a social model, and the American way to do things. Or let me give you another example. British and American systems, many people thinking and always saying, they are very similar. Well, take, for example, the way how the people in the UK feel about their national health system. And while the resistance against, for example, Obama keep on growing in the United States against his Obamacare. Another example that I want to give to you is that, in my opinion, a federal political union is certainly not a threat to cultural diversity. On the contrary, it's a warrant, it's a guarantee for cultural diversity, a federal political system in Europe. And some people could say, but can that work? Well, I'm always referring to another professor, then Amartya Sen, who is in his book Identity and Violence, he speaks about India. He knows very well. India is a continent with 2,000 ethnies, with 20 languages, with 4 different religions, and nevertheless it's one political union. So a federal political system is a system that gives the possibility to organize a public space on a continent by just guaranteeing the identities that are living on that continent, guaranteeing the cultural diversity. And I think that the Swiss Confederation in itself is a proof of that. The question is now, that's my third point that I want to make here, what went wrong in union? Why we see this 4 negative slides that have been showed a few minutes ago? Well, to give an answer to that question, let me start with a book, and the book that find one of the good books of the last year is Why Nations Fail, of Akamulu and Robinson, who are saying mainly it's not the economics stupid, it's politics stupid that count. Politics, why? Because in Why Nations Fail, they are very well illustrating that you need democratic institutions on the midterm and certainly on the long term if you want to have a good economic growth and a good welfare in your society. And that is the problem in the European Union. What went wrong is institutionally. This crisis is an economic crisis, but this economic crisis is only a consequence, is the fallout of something different, of an institutional crisis, a deep institutional crisis that started a number of years ago, more than a decade ago, when we introduced the euro, and we start to introduce the euro and then to reflect on the consequences of it. I'm always making the comparison with the United States of America. In the United States of America, they started with a confederation based on unanimity. It didn't work. Then we got the Convention of Philadelphia, and in the Convention of Philadelphia, they changed the confederation and the federation, saying that it was from that time on a qualified majority who ran the federation. And they introduced at that moment, a few years later, after a battle between Hamilton and Jefferson, the treasury certificates. And then later on, a treasury on the federal level. And only later on, in the 19th century already, they introduced a common currency, the dollar. We Europeans are far more intelligent. We start with a common currency, and then, as the problem starts, we say, oh shit, we need some institutions that we don't have for the moment. We have no common governance. We have no common treasury. We have no banking union. We have no, and then starts the whole bunch and range of reforms that are needed. And in the meanwhile, we think that it is a huge political body that we have created on European level, a huge political body that represents 1% of the European GDP, 1% compared to Switzerland, the Confederation, 15% of the Swiss GDP, or the United States of America, 24% of the American GDP. We are talking about a big problem, Europe, and a big bureaucracy, that is a European Union of 1% of the European GDP, with more or less 25,000 civil servants, something like Paris or London. That is the comparison that I can make. And in the meanwhile, we have created different European unions. You have the European Union of the 9, the 11, the 12, the 15, the 18 of the euro, the 25, the 28 naturally. We have the opt-ins and opt-outs. And Switzerland is in the Schengen, but Britain is not in Schengen. Switzerland is outside the Union, and Britain is inside the European Union. Nobody can, since a few years, explain anymore what the European Union really means to the public opinion. And the consequence of this is naturally that we see this drop in the trust of the public opinion. So we need to fix a number of things. We need to make a real political union based on a real democracy. Real democracy is where it are the citizens who are paying for something. You know, that's not the case in the European Union. You pay to your member state, and it are the member states who make contributions. And that is one of the reasons why we have this battle now with Mr. Cameron wanting his money back and in any way not willing to pay more by the end of the year. So we need a system in which direct citizens are paying for the European Union. We need also transnational lists so that you can vote not only for somebody of your country, but that you can vote for, because real European elections, that doesn't exist. You can only vote for your national candidate. So everybody is talking about Europe. Well, my point of view is Europe doesn't exist today. We have to invent it the fastest as possible. Otherwise, we can better stop with this adventure of the euro. And if we want to continue with the euro, we shall have to make our homework the fastest as possible. Thank you very much for your attention.
The first question is by Alberto Alessina.
Yes, thank you. I have a few random comments because several statements made by the last speaker really surprised me. I would say almost shocked me.
That was the intention.
The first one was that perhaps not the most important one, is that the welfare of Italy and Sweden is identical. That is remarkable. I mean, Italy doesn't have unemployment subsidies, does not have unemployment subsidies. They have a system which is completely screwed up for a variety of reasons, which I won't bother you with, but it doesn't work. The level in which welfare is done in Italy is completely inefficient, while in Sweden it's very costly, but extremely efficient. Then I hear saying that Europe does not impose to anybody to do the same thing. In the famous Lisbon Treaty, about whom we heard for years, that decade, the loud in the Lisbon Treaty, there were points that said every single country in Europe should have a certain percentage of children between the age of X and Y in publicly supported preschool. That was the prescription of the Lisbon Treaty. Of course, the Lisbon Treaty then was sort of irrelevant, but the question is, why do European politicians keep writing irrelevant documents? The third one, we heard about how wonderful the construction, according to following the Acemoglu and Robinson argument, how wonderful was the construction of the United States. You forgot to mention that there was the most violent, sanguinous civil war in the U.S. It was the most dramatic civil war that occurred. So it wasn't exactly a great success. If you look at the data on reciprocal trust across countries, the two countries that, according to this World Value Survey, that hate the most each other are England and France, not surprisingly. And a crazy party in Italy that, however, has 30% of the vote, claims that the real enemy is not ISIS, but is the ECB. And there are other parties in other countries in Europe, perhaps hopefully not as big as this crazy party in Italy, that say similar things. If on the basis of this you think that we are close to political union in Europe, I think you're very optimistic.
Yeah, first of all, what I have said is that if you have a currency union, you need also a political union. You can have one single a country can use a foreign currency, and that happens. And there are countries who are using the dollar, and there are countries who are using even the euro today, who are not in the European Union. That happens, but the opposite, that doesn't exist. A currency needs a state authority behind him. Otherwise, it is not a stable currency. That is what I have said. And that is what we are living through today. That is the problem. That is the reason why I'm saying it's not an economic crisis, it's more an institutional and political crisis, what we are living. Our incapacity to make this political union. I'm not stupid, I see the reality, and the reality is that for the moment, a number of member states are not willing to transfer additional sovereignty to the European level to make it work. That's the reality, because that's the most difficult thing to do in politics. That is to convince a politician to give away sovereignty to somebody else. You think that it's happening like, oh yeah, do that. Oh yeah, here, take it. Take my power, take my influence. That doesn't work like that. unfortunately. So this crisis, and I hope that this crisis shall be the start of a push towards a political union. Otherwise, this crisis will simply continue. We have already entered, I think, in a long period of economic stagnation, a little bit the Japanese style, a Japanese winter, I call it. Maybe we shall have it for 10, 12 years because our incapacity to do this jump forward to a political union and to a new governance model inside the European Union. Because, let's be honest, you have given one example of something that is in the Lisbon Treaty. The reality is far more simple. That is that there doesn't exist a governance in the Eurozone. There exists a coordination of economic policies. And it has a name, the Lisbon Strategy. We changed it later on in the 2020 strategy. And that is the only economic governance that exists, besides the Stability Pact. The Stability Pact, naturally, about the fiscal deficit. But that is nothing at all. It are a number of recommendations to the member states. It is printing documents, in fact. That is, it is the economic governance inside the European Union. Printing documents every year on what the lack is of this and the lack on that and the recommendation on innovation and on research, but it's not a real governance of the Eurozone. That doesn't exist for the moment. And so, to establish this governance of the Eurozone, I'm not in favor of harmonizing everything. I'm in favor of convergence policy, where at least the European Union oblige the member state to respect a number of minimum values and maximum values. They can follow their own policies. You can keep the left side of the road, if you are a left side government, or the right side of the road, but at least you have to stay between the borders on which we have made the conclusion. And that's not only on deficits, it's not only about the fiscal deficit of countries, the Stability Pact. It has also to be a conversion policy on pension reforms, on labor market reforms. And I'm saying that because otherwise it is impossible to continue with the euro and with the single currency. So that's my point. I'm not blind. I know it shall be very difficult, but it's one or the other. Or we do that step forward, and then it's viable, or we don't do that, and then we have to give it up, the single currency.
Okay, let me throw out one question for maybe Guido or Joel. How much of a constraint on European policy making are cultural differences? And have we rediscovered just how different we are as a result of the crisis?
Well, it's difficult to tell. I think, of course, we probably have a much stronger sense of national identity than we have of European identity. But I think, in my opinion, the problem is not so much the different cultural identities. The problem, I think, is that we chose the wrong path to achieve political integration. I think that the compelling argument to achieve political integration is to say we live in a global world, we cannot deal with the global challenges as individual isolated countries, and we need to get together. And so that calls for identifying foreign policy and defense policy and public goods that are critical in a global world as the arguments on which to build unification. And of course, there would be political resistance, and I think the biggest political resistance, in my opinion, in that case, would not so much have been the national cultural differences, but perhaps more the delegation problem that you have in national politics. Of course, national politicians don't want to have federal politicians to take away power. But if you convince public opinion that there is a shared common interest, then maybe you can overcome this delegation problem. And instead, we chose the path of creating the single currency. And the reason why I think that was the wrong path and may reveal to be a dramatic mistake in the end is because it created divisiveness. It created different interests rather than shared interests. And it's true that we need a common fiscal policy and political union to have a single currency. But the single currency exposed the sharply different national interests that we have. And so now the argument is not so much how do we deal with global challenges, China, the environment, Mr. Putin, the debate is how do we get out of this mess and without falling into transferring to other people, bailing out, or doing the interests of other countries. And I don't see how we can get out of this, not because of cultural differences, but because of genuine economic conflict that we have created.
I just wanted to add that I think the concept of political integration, we should all keep this in mind, is really quite sort of a hit and miss thing. And to think about areas that became politically integrated over the last, say, 200 years, the track record is extremely mixed. So there are two major success stories in this, which is, of course, the unification of Italy around 1860 and unification of Germany in the late 1860s and culminating in 1871. Now, for better or for worse, we should consider these, if not unqualified success stories, at least stable unions. But for every Germany and for every Italy that we have places where political integration failed for one reason or another. The example of Yugoslavia, of course, comes to mind. But sometimes even nations that seem to be very similar. And the country, Mr. Verhofstadt's country, and the country in which I was born, were put together in 1815 as the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. And then in 1830, not long after, there was this reasonably amicable divorce, almost amicable, I'd say. And after a few years of adjustment, they lived happily ever after as two independent nations. The same happened in Norway and Sweden in the beginning of the 20th century. So political union sometimes works and sometimes it doesn't work. And it's very difficult to know whether it's language or culture or religion that keeps countries together. I don't think that even if the integration that Mr. Verhofstadt is thinking about were to be brought about, that there is reason to believe that this would be stable in the very long run and that it wouldn't break up, even if a federal government was brought about. And somebody already mentioned that the United States once came awfully close to break up. It has been a success story, but I really don't think that we can take the American example and implement it to Europe, saying if the Americans could do it 230 years ago, we can do it today. I don't think history really allows itself to make these easy generalizations. And think just for a moment about how Russia, which was also a multinational country, fell apart very quickly between 1990 and 1991, in which lots of countries seceded very quickly. And how Czechoslovakia fell apart a few years later. I mean, these political unions, they come and they go, and there is really fairly small things can pull them asunder.
Short remark. When you give Yugoslavia as an example of Russia, that are not federal democratic states, that were centralized communist states. And so it is not a failure of federalism that Russia fell apart and trying to come back for the moment, or that Yugoslavia fell apart. There are far other reasons for that. So the Ottoman Empire, Balkan, it's a long story. Failure there also to combine. So the reason why I have tackled nationalism is because Wilson, after the First World War, thought that he could solve the question of nationalities in Europe. That was his aim. He came to Europe in 1919. He launched all over Europe referenda in Poland, in Denmark, in Schleswig-Holstein, in a number of countries, just to solve that problems of nationalities. And he wanted to give to every nationality, to every identity, to every language, his own state. And it has created what we have seen. The problems with minorities everywhere in Europe, leading at the end to fascism, Nazism, and to the Second World War. That's the outcome of that reasoning that we have seen after the attempt of Wilson to solve our problems. So I'm thinking that in the world of tomorrow, is a globalized world, we have certainly in Europe an interest to work together on a higher level, on a supranational level. For a number of reasons. First of all, geopolitical, because we are losing our influence. What's happening now in Ukraine is a shame, mostly for Europe, who is not reacting to this, because it is not a geopolitical reality that can counterweight to Russia and to Putin. Secondly, economically. economically, we have a huge problem. Let me give you the example of a small company, a young company, who is doing innovation on the internet, and they want to launch their innovation, to put it on the market. In Europe, you need 28 authorizations to do that. And if you have still a courage to continue, you need 250 agreements with the operators and the telecom companies in Europe. And then you can launch on this market your innovation. In the US, it's one authorization, and it's 3 agreements that you make with the 3 main operators that are active in the US. So that's an economic reason that I want to give, that in the modern world, in the globalized world, we need to have such a federal European Union to count on economically and politically. There is a third element, how you deal with our problems. Is climate change stopping at the national borders, maybe? You need to tackle that problem, a bigger entity, and that is the European Union. And I think that there is that we live in a new age of empires, that I'm called. It's not longer the age of the nation states. Excuse me, that's a little bit over. We are living in a new age of empires in which politically you have to organize yourself that you can be an alternative, that you can speak directly to China, to Russia, to India, to the US and to other empires in the world. And that is at stake. And on top of that, we have that cultural identity that exists in Europe. If you go from the Atlantic Ocean until the Volga, you shall see in architecture, for example, the same trend, the same culture. What did Goethe? The first thing he did was to go to Italy to discover Europe, because for a German, to go to Italy was discovering Europe. So Europe exists, and it is nationalism that had put in our minds that we needed to organize our politics around ethnicity and around language that has created all the troubles in which we are today.
Also in my eyes is that we have now the European Union, and the euro is a part of the big problem we have now. In my eyes, the following the way or going the way with the EFTA would have been very better and would be also today better.
But even the British doesn't longer believe in the EFTA. You have to see the big building of the EFTA in Brussels, because the headquarters is there, a small little building there, the EFTA. And the British have made a very simple reasoning. They have said, okay, internal market shall be created where? In the EFTA? No, in the European Union. And that's the reason why they came in the European Union, because of the internal market that was launched at that time.
Okay. Let's take a couple of questions.
Yeah, sorry. I'm a politician, that's the consequence of it, naturally.
Thank you very much for this very interesting debate. I'm a bit worried that we keep on criticizing everything that we gained over those so many years of cooperation within the Europe. I mean, here we take things for granted. We think cultural diversity, we take it for granted. The peace, everything what we gain, we take for granted. My question is, in the current situation, don't you think that what we lack in Europe is a true leader, not even a leadership, just a leader, somebody people would trust in, people would follow, that they will give them hope? Because we could be on criticizing, we see the statistical data going down, even though I don't fully agree, because still European institutions are one of the most trusted institutions in Europe. So don't you think that this, there was once Polish foreign minister being Germany, calling for German leadership in Europe? I mean, how much did we came, if you know a bit of history between Poland and Germany, that a Polish politician can go and can make a call like this, that we are so far in our progress, in our relationship over the years? Don't you think that this common leadership would solve some of the key problems that we have right now?
Okay, let's take a couple of questions together. So, this over there.
First of all, I want to point out that we seem to give for granted probably the most important achievement of Europe over the last 60 years, which is the single market for goods and services, which I think is an amazing result, and we all think that that's a normal thing to be achieved. And I think we need to preserve it, because that's the only reason why Europe is still together, because the new generation are actually used to deal with one single market moving around. They don't want any constraints. In fact, I think that the best way to deal with the cultural diversity would be to promote a much more multilingual and interdisciplinary education. And I want to know if that is actually shared by the panel.
Over here.
There are a lot of cultural difficulties to cope with in Europe. But I give you an example just in a few seconds. First, remember, William Spencer Churchill spoke on September 16th, 1946 at Zurich University. Let Europe arise, he told us. He told everybody in Europe. He meant arise from the ruins. Now we have a problem because we have a financial problem within Europe. And imagine there are still cultural differences. How can you cope with one football team within Europe, representing Europe, consisting of 3 Germans, 2 French, 2 British, no Ronaldo because there is no space for him in this team? Well, I think there are a lot of things to be matched first, and we have to decide either we want to have a United States of Europe, or we have the so-called Europe of Vaterländer, Europe of nations, as was represented by Charles de Gaulle.
Okay, let's take one more.
Hi, my question is about the fact that up to 2 years ago it was a common topic about the 2 euro currencies, if still this can make an argument of discussion. And I would like to add also whether we could talk about a remark on the fact that there might be also a cultural diversity between generations, because the young generations, perhaps in Europe, are much more homogeneous than the former ones, and whether this could be an economic resource as well. Thank you.
Okay, and Fabrizio?
So I wanted to raise one point. This tendency to disintegration is clearly strong at the European level, but it's not necessarily the case that countries are doing much better. So there is a lot of tension, even in keeping together individual countries. Think, just the Balkan was mentioned before, Spain and Catalonia, Scotland went close to it. So I wonder if actually Europe could be an answer to those tensions rather than the problem. But of course, to be an answer, I think one has to break the link between political integration and centralization. In that sense, I think Switzerland is an example of something that has worked very well. It is a unit, it is a political unit, it is a confederation that is not questioned, as far as I understand, in its identity. But it has a very limited and well-defined set of tasks that are at the federal level, and then there is a lot more of decentralization than in any other country I know. And at some level, that could also solve the problem of cultural diversity within Europe, which is, again, not only across the existing set of countries, but also within the countries. Of course, it's a very different construction from the one we have seen, that, as it was mentioned before, has been characterized instead by a lot of emphasis on standards, directive, etc. So I think that this is also something that we should discuss.
Okay, Guido, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah. So let me tackle the questions in the order in which or comments in which they have to come. So on leadership, so let me continue my negative view, which maybe it's impossible to predict the future, of course. But let me continue with the negative argument. I think one reason for being skeptical that it is just a problem of lack of leadership is the plunge in the trust towards the ECB. If there is an institution that has taken intellectual leadership and that has really been a champion of euro area interest, it's the ECB. I think it has succeeded in doing that despite the big constraints that it has had. And yet we see a big distrust and lack of confidence towards the ECB. That makes me a bit skeptical that it is just an issue of lack of leadership. Second issue on the youth and on education. So I think it's right that the younger generations are more favorable to further steps towards integration. This comes out of the Eurobarometer surveys and other opinion polls. However, you also see there that the change in attitudes, it's actually sharper amongst the youth than amongst the more senior European citizens. So the youth continues to remain more pro-European, but the derivative, the change, is actually going down more quickly. And it is true that education is the way to create common cultural identities. This is how Italy and, of course, many other nation states built a national identity through a public education system. So I agree that that's certainly something we need to go. We need to put European history and European identity as a goal much more prominently in our own national education system. However, there too, there are some not so positive results. There are studies that have looked at the consequences of the Erasmus program in Europe. Of course, the Erasmus programs, the student exchange program, was designed precisely in order to create a common shared European identity. And the studies that have compared, for instance, the European attitudes of students that went through these programs before and after their participation in the program show very small or no results. Now, this could be that the people that have gone into these programs are already very strong pro-Europe, and so the treatment is not so useful, and we would need the same treatment on non-university students, on less educated individuals. But nevertheless, the evidence suggests that the Erasmus programs has not been so effective. On two euro currencies, I don't see how that is a way forward. Once we break the single currency, we instill the idea that this is just a fixed exchange rate system, and then everything collapses again. So we may as well abandon it. Last issue, if I may, on what Fabrizio suggested. I think I agree very much with the idea that there is a demand for integration. So my negative views are conditional on the way we have gotten here, certainly not on normative ground. But I think that's precisely, in my opinion, what should have been done, and we didn't do, namely to identify the public goods that were really those on which the European government could make a difference. And I'm afraid that the euro, the single currency, maybe wasn't the right choice there.
So I'd like to bring in Joel on this.
Yeah, so I want to respond to the question in the back, which said that the most important achievement of the EU is to create a single market for goods and services, and that was a magnificent achievement, and I completely agree. Also, I would probably still put that achievement behind the achievement which was, of course, recognized by the Nobel Prize Committee a few years ago, and that the main achievement of the EU has been that it stopped Europeans from killing each other now for a very long period. And what's more than that, I think it's not just that we have peace in Europe, but that in fact Europe has, to a very large extent, maybe more than most people are comfortable with, been demilitarized. That the huge armed camps that we saw in Europe exactly a century ago, and that led to all the devastation of the First and then the Second World War, that war, even if we tried it today, we wouldn't have the hardware and the soldiers to fight it, because decades and decades of peace have essentially made Europe a de facto demilitarized area. And I think that's all for the better. I wish the rest of the world was like that. The other issue that I have, and that I think is going to be the big test of the EU, is that the principles that Guy Verhofstadt talked about, which is the principles of democracy, of honest government, the lack of corruption, human rights, equality before the law, if those principles, which we know are very much part of the ruling culture and ideology of the EU, can be imposed on every one of those members. And we have a few test cases that are right now on the front burner. I'm thinking first and foremost of Hungary, where we are observing these days a case of emergent Putinism in Hungary itself. And Hungary is a part of the EU. And the real question is, will they be able to impose the Enlightenment standards of the rest of Europe on Hungary, or will this fail? We had an earlier case about 10 years ago, some people may remember, of the case of Jörg Haider in Austria, in which some EU pressure actually was important in preventing him from coming to power, as I recall. That, I think, will be extremely important. There is a third aspect of the EU which I think is undervalued, and that has also to do with the imposition of these principles. And that's something like that the reason people love to hate Brussels, as Guido shows, is in part because local leaders, local governments have used Brussels as an excuse to impose certain reforms that were necessary but unpopular. And the sense is, if they were not part of the EU, this would be rather difficult to sell to the local polity. But now they have a good excuse. They say, we know it hurts, we don't want to do it, but Brussels makes us. You know, wink, wink, nod, nod, because everybody understands that this is what is necessary. I think that function of the EU actually tends to be underrated. But I have seen many cases in which this kind of reform is imposed. A good example is what's happening these days in Romania, where there now is a very fierce struggle against corruption, which was rife in the country, and there now is an office of anti-corruption fighters, and there's a recent survey of that in The Economist. And basically the argument is, look, you know, we know this hurts, we know this, we're putting people in jail, but we have to do this because we have to comply with the standards of the community of which we are part.
Very good. Guy?
Yeah, I want to underscribe that element of the values. So I think that is one of the biggest tests. Everybody's talking about the Stability Pact, but there is another pact that we have in the European Union, and that is the treaty and the principles in the treaty. And there we have, it's enormous difficult to become member of the European Union. And you have to apply the Copenhagen criteria. It's about democracy, values, lack of corruption. Once you're in, then it's easier, and then you can do what you want, and that cannot continue. I think one of the big tests, besides the economic test that we have, is on values, and certainly Hungary is a typical example of that. A government who is creating a tax on media, on newspapers and on televisions, and then they say, yeah, but if you are a little bit in favor of us, then it's not necessary to pay that. That is what is really happening there. That's one example of a whole range of practices there. And until now, we didn't have seen a European Union capable to deal with this problem. We have an article in the treaties, Article 7, that I have discussed that with Mr. Schussel after the Austrian and the Haider issue. It was put into the treaty to deal with these cases, but nobody until now has got the courage, certainly not in the Council, to use it. And maybe the article is far too complicated to be practical, put in practice. My second point is, look to the defense policy. Yeah. We wanted to start with the defense community. You remember that's 54, when the French Assembly voted against the defense community. And that's the reason we came to economics and to the coal and steel community, because the defense community was not accepted by the French National Assembly. Other issue where we need progress, migration policy. The migration policy in Europe is a disaster in consistency, and certainly a disaster if you look to what's happening in the Mediterranean, the suffering there, and the responsibility that we all have for that. For example, if you want to ask for asylum, you need to come into Europe instead of maybe organizing another system, in common system. Maybe to speak about legal migration. There should be a legal migration policy that we don't have in Europe for the moment, and that creates more and more illegal migration if you don't have a legal migration policy. Climate change, we've spoken already about that. Education culture. I have to tell you, education culture, it's forbidden by the treaty for Europe. It's a non-go area. Besides Erasmus and a little bit of subsidies at the right and at the left, but in fact, education and culture is seen as subsidiarity and as a competence solely for the member states. And not for, while I think maybe we should do the opposite. And if we want to create a more European feelings and European identity, maybe we have also to take more initiatives on that level. And to finish about a lack of leadership, yeah, lack of leadership, more even than a lack of leadership, we have so many leaders. It's the Kissinger question. And that has not been solved in the meanwhile. In the meanwhile, he has not one telephone, not two, but at least 4 or 5 telephone numbers. To which he has to, the president of the council, the president of the commission, parliament, and so on and so on. So, but I think it's a lack of leadership there is, and I compare it with the time of Delors, Jacques Delors. You can be in favor or against Delors, but Delors had a vision, and he said in the 80s. You remember in the 80s we were also stuck in an economic crisis, in a deep economic crisis, and at that moment, Delors launched this idea of an internal market, and he launched also this 92. In 92, everything should change. And what the small and medium companies did, and bigger companies did, was to anticipate this opening of this market. It has created a huge growth in the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s. So we need again such a vision, because Mr. Delors had a far broader vision about the internal market than the internal market that was established. The internal market we established was mainly consumer goods. Nothing else. Because the strategic markets that are so important today were still closed. Energy markets. It's still. Yeah, we pay the double of our energy as the Americans, but we want to be competitive with the Americans. It's a little bit difficult, because there is no energy grid in Europe. So if you produce, for example, solar energy in Spain, you cannot even export it to France. And that is the consequence of it, that we pay double the prices as our competitors. Or digital. Well, you use your mobile in Europe, and you know what Europe means. It doesn't exist because 10 kilometers before the border, stops, no coverage anymore. And then 10 kilometers over the border, it works again, because then you're with a national provider of that country in which you enter. Yeah, for 10, 15 kilometers, it doesn't work, your mobile. Because we have in total hundreds of different operators instead of real European champions also in telecommunication. So digital, telecoms. We can talk about capital markets that exist in European capital market. If you have collateral, for example, in Belgium, a house, and you do a business in Italy, you want to start a business in Italy. Do you think that you can have a loan of an Italian bank with your collateral in Belgium? Or in another country? Not possible. Impossible. There is no common mortgage rules in Europe. Capital markets are not unified. So that is the way forward. And for that we need, in fact, leadership, vision, and a little bit of passion also for Europe.
Okay, let's take one more question here over here. Richard?
Actually, it's 2, but still. For Joel, look, first, just a qualification to your story, and that is that competition of standards, for example, can lead to the lowest common denominator just as well as to the highest. But now, broadening it, in Europe, we have, for economists anyway, we have a network that functions in many of the ways that you suggest. We have Vox EU, which functions actually in terms of communication. But we have one country, I'm afraid, that isn't fully a part of this. That's Germany. There is a very inward-looking character to German economics. And that, if you look at Wolfgang Münchau in the Financial Times today, talking about the narrative in Germany. It's a very powerful statement. He may be overstating it, but I think essentially it's true. And if you look around you here today, the picture is quite different. Here we are in the UBS Center, and the speakers on the program are British, French, German, Italian, American, and Greek. The center has an Austrian director and an Italian research director. I think this would be rather difficult to envisage in the German context. And I think that has led to, that is one of the elements, only one, that has led to a kind of unified narrative of what's been going on over the past few years, which has big problems with it. And then the other one, quickly to Guido, I rather share Guy's point about, view about leadership. I mean, if you look back, let's go back before Delors, I can remember that, to the establishment of the European monetary system. Collaboration between Schmidt, Giscard, and Roy Jenkins. Right? Now, those were people of stature. And I don't want to comment on particular individuals today in similar positions, but...
It's done.
And Guido, I think your example of the ECB and the way opinion polls treated is not entirely a fair one. I yield to no one in my admiration for and friendship with Mario Draghi, but who elected Mario? What's the political legitimacy of the bank? And I think that is the problem with for the ECB.
I just tell a story. Okay. Joel?
Well, I don't know what's wrong with Germany, Richard, but I'll tell you a story taking you back to the period I talked about, which is the 16th and 17th century. So you may recall Charles V, who was at the same time the Habsburg Emperor, King of Spain, and the Duke of many, many regions throughout Europe. And so one of the issues that he had was what we talked about, which is what language would he speak? And so once the story goes, he was asked by one of his courtiers, Your Highness, what language do you really speak? And he says, well, I speak Spanish with my confessors, Dutch with my advisors, French with my mistresses, and German to my horse.
That's a well-known.
Very good. Guido, you want to come in?
I think I agree with you. No, I agree with what Richard said. There is an important difference, I think, in the generation of these political leaders, and probably having gone through World War II was something unique that current political leaders do not have. And this, I think, really brings, in the long run, let me just make this final statement. I think in the long run, what really matters, I'm convinced, is really the education and not just the economics interests. And having a more European proactive role in education, in primary education, I think is really important. If I think about how I was brought up taught about the miracles of the Italian Risorgimento and the heroes of the Italians that went to war against the Austrians and the Germans. And this is how we still teach national history in Italy, and I suppose that the same, with opposite connotations, would be true in other European countries. So having an education system that teaches the Republic of Letters and how proud we should be of being European in today's world may have a long-term impact in the distant future.
I say amen to that.
Guy, you want to come in with a rousing closing statement?
Certainly not on the languages and Charles V. Charles V was born in Ghent. I live in Ghent, so we're at 100 meters were the city center where he was born. And in fact, he spoke also Dutch because he lived mainly not in Spain, but in the Low Countries. in Mechelen and in Ghent and so on. But it illustrates this common ground that we have, and that we can never forget. But this common ground and this common history is actually not enough. You need also to have a plan for the future and a project for the future, because people are voting for that. If we want to resolve that problem, that said that the figures of confidence are even worse for national parliaments and national politicians than for Europeans. Maybe that has to be underlined once. But if we want to raise that confidence of people, it depends on a project, on a vision. People are voting for such a vision and a project. And if we don't have, again, a political class in Europe who is doing that, then we shall have tough times in the coming decades.
Okay, thank you very much. There was no lack of diversity on the podium. Thank you.